Hello and welcome. It's the top of the hour. My name is Paul Batalden, and I'm joined by Tina Foster, John Balat, uh, Julie Johnson, Erica Van Sitters, Rachel Fortino, and Joy McAvoy in bringing this presentation number 5 in the series of co-production of healthcare service. We're especially pleased to have John joining us today. As just a brief, quick review, this series is aimed at opening and exploring the underlying knowledge, skill, and habits that are involved in the co-production of healthcare service, and to open some of the implications of that. And our assumptions, the general assumptions under this, is that a person's health is really his or her own health. It's not easily outsourceable. And that healthcare work is fundamentally a service, and it's made as a service with a logic that involves two parties. And that's different than the logic of making a product. The third assumption is that co-production is fundamental to service creation and development because there are two parties that are involved in making the service. And the lived reality for those persons that we sometimes know as professionals matters to their abilities to participate in this co-productive work. This framing invites different ways of thinking about value creation and its study, and opens up models that are connected to these assumptions. We engage in this on the platform of a long tradition of working on quality and the improvement of quality of healthcare. If we go back 100 years, the focus was on the thresholds for what constituted a good hospital or a good healthcare service. And that tradition of focus on thresholds has served healthcare service very well and in many ways, and continues to be of value to us. About 40 years ago, we began to notice that enterprise-wide systems for quality and safety worked in other sectors and began to be used in healthcare settings to focus on the best disease management. And these enterprise-wide systems opened up new ways for us to think about systems and processes and reliability and customer supplier relationships and so on. And as we now move forward, we begin to see that there might be a new question that might be worth considering. And that question might be something like, how might we improve the value of the contribution that healthcare service makes to health? And it's in that frame or that bucket that we are sort of working as we're trying to explore. And it isn't because we want to diminish the efforts in quality 1.0 or quality 2.0, but it's because we think that these considerations open up some new ways that offer us more insight that are directly relevant today. At the heart of healthcare service is this coupling of a relationship and action. And these elements are held together by knowledge and skill and habit, shared power, a willingness to be vulnerable and to engage. And in the background of all of this lurk a host of circumstantial variables that either make it easy or hard for this core work to go on. And we see this at work at the individual level and at the population or macro system level. And we constructed a pedagogy for trying to think about this. And last time we were talking about science-informed practice. And we took that term from Trish Greenhalgh, a professor of primary care at Oxford, who suggested that we've tended to use the term evidence-based medicine when in fact it isn't evidence that we have, but it doesn't mean we don't want to be curiously, scientifically inquiring of the situation, or to use our powers of observation and empirical reasoning to try to understand what's going on. And so she says we would be better off using the term science-informed practice. And I like that frame, but I think that it even opens up a broader consideration about the multiple scientific epistemologies or scientific ways of knowing that underpin the disease or the condition and its biology. The experience of that disease or condition in life, or how we might understand illness and the difference between disease and illness, and then healthcare service. And all three of these elements, in fact, are informed by differing kinds of scientific methods. And as we thought further about that, we realized that these multiple modes of scientific inquiry would open up this lifetime worth of work and inquiry and development. And that learning to be a science-informed practitioner involves learning how to do science, the methods of observation and description and measurement and cause and effect and tests of change and so on in daily work. Our models and our measures, which are done to facilitate the testing, however, might be confused for what they model. And in the circumstance of that occurring, we would have made the error of confusing the map for the territory. In truth, it's never really one stream of knowledge alone that we use, but it's multiple streams of knowledge that are always at work. And if the practices are co-produced, it may well be that what the Dutch refer to as the individual formerly known as patient, TIFCAP, might have contributions. That is to say, the person sometimes known as a patient might have contributions to the developmental and the research agendas that we are engaged with every day. So that was last time. But today, our focus is on number 5, this empathic understanding of the individual, sometimes known as a professional. And how might we understand sort of that stream of knowledge and habit and driver of co-produced healthcare service? And the assumptions under today's theme are that as persons sometimes known as professionals, we realize that a healthcare service requires both a relationship and some actions. And this invites us to explore relationship making as a fundamental part of our work. This is not something it would be nice to do. This is an obligatory part of the work. And as relationship participants, we realize that we are actually kin to the other in the relationship. And when we do realize that, we learn how fundamental that really is. As humans, we assume, we are deeply wired to help each other, even as we may be tempted to adopt a lesser view of the other for some reason. Our work settings that we work in struggle with both social and cost accountability. And sometimes, maybe inadvertently, we are made to feel like we are a gear in some big machine. And when that happens, it's hard to remember our kinshipness with the person we are facing. Number 5, COVID has administered a stress test to the system. And with that stress test, we have been allowed to revisit the fundamentals at the same time that we are quite plainly exhausted. The 6th assumption is that we realize that this way of thinking offers the possibility of a rediscovery of some of the real joys in the professional's work, and that work settings matter. Like all models, we need to be mindful of the way the model doesn't work or the limitations in the model, because all models are limited. Some are useful. So our focus today is informed by the work of this man, John Ballat, and his co-authors, Penelope Campling and Chris Maloney, who wrote this wonderful book, Intelligent Kindness. In its 2nd edition, its cover looks like the one on the picture. In that book, what they suggest is that kindness is both an obligation to our kin that is born out of an understanding of our connectedness and the natural expression of our attitudes and feelings that arise from this connectedness. And they suggest that this isn't just some kind of foo-foo or peripheral kind of issue, but rather that it's a binding, creative, and problem-solving force that inspires and directs our attention and efforts as we and our organizations work toward building relationships with those that are cared for. It's not a nice side issue in the project of competitive progress. It's the glue of cooperation required for such progress to be of most benefit to most people. And those words and this man really caught my attention. It's my treat to have John join us. And I asked him if there were a few pictures that he wanted to work from and share with us. But before we get into that, John, welcome. And please feel free to direct my work as your slide advancer.
Thank you very much, Paul. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
That's fine. And am I visible or invisible?
Yes, you're visible. And so you can discard the cloak that you had earlier.
Right, fine. So if you wouldn't mind clicking the first slide. What I want to talk about is something that I hope builds the bridge between, as it were, the science of biology, etc., and of systems, and the science of understanding how human beings glue themselves together to face challenges, to face problems, to produce creativity, to address risk, and indeed to deal with the complexities of illness and the ill-being, the social ill-being that is always associated with illness, even from the common cold. So if you wouldn't mind clicking the first button, I'm going to bring this word kinship into the picture. And the first thing I want to acknowledge is that this word kinship can be used in several ways. It can be used to say, this is what you ought to be doing, get on with it. And it's a good thing, isn't it? Or it can be used intelligently. There's a massive understanding of research, of historical reference, of developed awareness of the way kinship is a two-edged, at least, thing. It binds us together, or it can be used to exclude the other. Whether that is another ethnicity, another gender, or another profession, or indeed the patient from us, the professionals. And being aware of that knife edge between kinship as an inclusive factor or a exclusive factor is where we start. I owe you as my colleague, or you as my so-called patient, to bring to it, the encounter, a knowledge that to build kinship with you, we will create and solve problems. We will create solutions and solve problems and thrive together and build something. I also need to be aware that I may well be moved to exclude you at various points when you irritate me, or when I don't understand you, or when my prejudices rise, or whatever. So I wanted to say that about kinship at the beginning. I hope it does actually reveal the dangers within the model in the word. If as Paul's previous slide mentioned, if my attention to the issue of kinship works productively, and I can find the need to recognize my colleague or my patient or even my boss, let's face it, as part of that kinship group, I will be moved towards trying to solve problems for them, with them. I will be moved towards attending to them in what might be called a kind way. But I want to keep stressing the word intelligent here. We're bringing our awareness to this. We're not just being nice. So if I move to attend in a kindly way to the other, then my attention is drawn to observing them more closely than it would be if I'm not. That attention means that I start to notice, they know they're noticed, we notice together. And that, we just had a comment about the show without the slideshow. That brings, thank you, for us. That brings the possibility of what many psychologists, especially of early development, has called attunement, where there is a kind of sense of instinctive cooperation, of noticing the right moment for things, of noticing the mood of the other, of noticing what they need, of noticing that they might want to say something, of noticing that they might be struggling to say something, etc., etc. That attunement, in turn, will lead to a sense of trust. So if I'm attuned with my doctor, I'll admit I drink 100 units per day rather than pretend that I drink one. I may cooperate with my medication. I may trust you as a colleague to do something in a way that is collegiate and cooperative rather than, sorry, I'm being slightly distracted by the comments that are coming up. That sense of trust is core to cooperative behavior, whether you're in a sports team, a musical group, a theatre group, a family on holiday, or indeed in a team in a hospital. That sense of trust enables something that, whether if it's with the patient, might be described as a therapeutic alliance. That therapeutic alliance in psychotherapy is where both parties are, as it were, contributing to the solution, to the understanding and to the solution. And of course, it is co-production. That's what that therapeutic alliance is. We shamelessly use the expression therapeutic alliance because it is both about the alliance between the therapists and the alliance with the patient. And yes, somebody has just brought up the word reciprocity. And indeed, there are many words for this. And as Paul says, one's model is selective in wording, but hopefully broad in meaning. Now, this is where
John, can you see what I've got now?
No, I can't see anything
okay.
apart from us. I'll be fine going through this slide, and then I'll bring up the other one myself and just check what I'm going to say.
Okay.
But I'm aware that this is taking time from people's contributions. So I'll just push on, Paul, don't worry.
Okay, good.
That sense of therapeutic alliance, that being in it together, that co-production is not just, in this virtuous circle I'm trying to describe to people, not just an experiential thing. We don't all just end up feeling better. I don't rate my doctor 10 out of 0 in terms of quality points. What I do is I get better. This is about efficiency and effectiveness. It is not just about the lived experience, the feeling of goodwill, etc., though both interact. So this virtuous circle is one that I, my fellow authors, feel very strongly should be seen as scientifically underpinned. It is underpinned by various models of psychology. And we should see it as not the science of the soft side versus the science of the hard side, but actually a core element to go alongside and to actually be the heart of the learning and delivery of practice. And that this, as I stress, is both about relationships between the individuals doing the work and relationships between them and the other, the patient, the manager, the politician, the community in which they provide their services. Clearly, to be able to engage with such a virtuous circle, I need the mental space and the ability to manage myself to actually do that. I also need a sense of freedom to act upon my intuitions, my knowledge, etc., etc. And of course, that sense of freedom to act has to also be underpinned by a set of skills, technical skills and other skills, whether they're the skills of manipulating a scalpel or the skills of relating to a distressed and frightened person. So this is not replacing skill with attitude. This is underpinning attitude and the way then service is delivered with underpinning skill with attitude and a psychological intelligence, as it were. Now, clearly, I also need a degree of imagination as to what my interventions may mean and do for the other, whether that's what it's going to be like for this person to manage the side effects of my intervention, or what it's going to be like for my colleague to say, help, if I need their help, or what it's going to be like for my colleague if I say, excuse me, you're about to cut the wrong breast off. So I'm using dramatic examples for shorthand here. I need some sense of imagination about how I might come over, how what I say may come over, what I propose may come over, what I may do will affect people. And of course, to be all those things, I need a sense of safety. I need to feel with my colleagues, amongst them, and in my work setting, I need to feel my anxiety, the inevitable anxiety of our task, our uncertainty, sometimes our downright fear about getting things wrong. I need some sense of containment, of understanding, a sense of being in a safe environment for any of that to work. And that leads me and my colleagues to argue for the fact that having a model for how that environment is built to promote that virtuous circle is as important as having a model for how to design the systems, decide what the inputs are, decide what the timelines are, decide what the targets at each step are, etc. So this is not, as Paul was saying with his quality 1, quality 2, quality 3, this is not to replace a technological, a systemic in the delivery sense model. It is not to suggest that that is bad. It is, however, to say that it can become very bad without the other model. It can become mechanical, it can become frightening, it can become driven, it can turn people into cogs. So as Paul's now brought a slide up, all will thrive better when staff at all levels value and attend to this relational approach. When members of teams and the wider networks understand what's involved in managing themselves together to sustain intelligent kindness, but also key when the system is organized, cultivated and supported as a positive kinship system, as well as a heavy duty task and role technical system. And I think that might be my last slide. I'm not sure.
One more, aspects of coping.
Yeah, all that I wanted to say here very briefly, given our time delays here, is that this needs addressing at an individual, at a team, at an inter-team, i.e. the bits of the system, at a whole system level. And it also crucially depends on the nature of leadership. I think, Paul, you're going to ask me some further questions, so I overlap.
If you're willing, we'll get some additional questions in the chat from people.
Well, I mean, I won't go through the detail of this slide.
Yeah.
we can refer to this when we get to it.
Yeah. So why don't we stop the screen sharing, Katrona, and let's just have a conversation for a while, John, because I think that what you offered, I think, is um, such an important kind of reflection on the situation we face today. And I was curious to know what prompted your interest in this. How did you and your co-authors come to uh, spend the time and effort to write a book, even to write a second edition?
Well, it's, I don't really know the answer to that. Things emerge, don't they? But I do think that having experience as a practitioner, a trainer, and a manager, and my colleagues having senior clinical and leadership positions in their background, we were all very disturbed to see that as resources might increase in our healthcare systems, as the capability of them to achieve ends, there were real problems with morale, with holding staff, with sustaining the quality of the relational environment. In fact, we saw that it was deteriorating in a lot of the organizations we knew. I've been working to support organizations ever since I left a senior role in our National Health Service. And we were very concerned about that. But all of us had a background at some point in our careers where we studied and were educated in what happens in groups. What happens in groups who are sitting for therapy, what happens in groups who are simply work groups or co-producing groups, or indeed conflictual groups. But the whole issue of how groups and then organizations work. And I was astonished to see so many of my colleagues going off on training for such matters, on management training and on organizational development training, and then coming back and behaving exactly the same as they did before. Because there was no kind of understanding about how to implement what they learned, but also no shared model that would hold people together as they shared their different perspectives. And so, if I were rude, I'd say the bully who was sent off on a course to understand how to manage people gently came back very keen on managing people gently and reverted to being a bully quite often. The person who could not actually dare to walk into the front line of practice continued not to be able to walk into the front line of practice. The clinician who was, how can I put it, not brilliant at their relationships with others, especially members of other professions, came back remediated from their group experience, but fell back into patterns of divisiveness, etc. Now, of course, this wasn't all negative. There were people who desperately wanted to apply what they'd learned and found no support for it, and really began to despair about staying and just went off and did more education and then left. And this was terrible. And I've also seen the opposite of all these things. I've seen better results in teams and services that are intelligently led with an eye to the quality of the lived experience and the relationships of their members. I've seen remarkable creativity and buy-in to change when service design has been collaborative and key centered around the lived experience of the patient and the professional. So I remember using, not long before we wrote the book, using an imaginary story about a family with a member with learning disabilities in it as the core for a massive piece of work to do with developing care pathways for various conditions that people with learning disabilities have. And the group became amazingly creative. And this was a group of 150 people. They were able to throw in, okay, let's do it if they've got this physical condition as well as their learning disability. Let's do it if mother's dementing. Let's do it if, and they started to bring the experience that the design of their work had excluded through the compartmentalizing of their practice. They began to build a connected picture, and they developed these care pathways quicker than any group I've ever worked with who did it in a more technical way. But more to the point, they were theirs. They knew exactly what they were for, and they got on with it. without any need to, you know, cheer them up and make them buy in. It was theirs. So
Yeah.
there was
Yeah.
co-production, but it was
Yeah.
co-production around personal stories.
Yeah. See, what I love about that, John, is that that illustrates the difference between what some have referred to as the toxicity of higher education, and that is embodied in the word about. So we can learn about kindness, or we can learn how to, as you say, and it's a very different kind of learning, and so the challenge was nicely illustrated in the example that you just gave. There's a comment by Safares who says basically that kindness is wisdom. And it reflects for me sort of the same truth that Ubuntu offers in South Africa, where we understand that this is not something that one has as an object added, but it is a subject. It's something that is that we are directly related to, and that is also connected to this example that you held out.
It is. I think also it's very important that, without hammering it away, that this word intelligence is maintained with it, because kindness can actually not be helpful. When groups of soldiers went into concentration camps at the end of World War II, they found starving people, and they were moved through kinship and kindness to give them food, but they didn't know that the food would kill them because they'd been so starved. So it is not about suggesting that kindness itself, without intelligence, knowledge, skills, etc., is going to make the difference. It is that kindness is the glue, as you mentioned before, or indeed the stimulus for the best use of those other skills and resources.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it is wise, but it's only wise when it's informed.
Yeah. Yeah. So Sarah suggests, so may John give a concrete example from his experience of sort of trying to help people do this, in addition to the one that you were giving while I think this text message was coming forward.
Well,
So
yes, I've given one example.
yeah.
I'll give two brief ones.
Yeah.
One simply about a network of very senior clinicians in an organization who I was called in to help because basically their morale was bad, conflict was bad, nobody would volunteer to take leadership roles on various themes because they felt they were going to be pulled down. Yep, that was roughly speaking the situation. I'm not sure that's quite how they described it at the beginning, but it's what I found.
Yeah.
And I and my colleague worked for a year, not every day, going regularly and working with them to explore how they behaved with each other as they approached task, and what was actually happening, what needed to be addressed before they could actually trust each other to cooperate. And all I would say is that made a difference. And I'm not going to go into the technical models we used to understand what was going on. I'm just going to say that made a difference.
Yeah.
Sickness rates went down, early retirements reduced, and actually they started to engage with things in the wider organization that were absolutely key to their working experience that they hadn't been engaged with because they didn't dare have any representatives out in that system for a long time. So that's one example.
Yeah.
And the other example is I guess I'd use from the point of view of a clinician. And this isn't my work, obviously, because I don't sit beside a clinician when they work with a patient. I sit with the clinician separately, mainly, although not when patients are there to co-create, but when they're there being looked after for their own needs. But I'm going to generalize this because I don't want to go too far into the detail. But a friend of mine fell off a cliff just before Christmas and nearly killed himself. Since then, he has been recovering, in inverted commas. He can now walk, which is brilliant, but not very well. He has experienced one encounter with a specialist physio and also with a specialist doctor in his condition. So experiences of those, one encounter with each of those, as simply being a tick box experience of where he was up to, what was wrong with him, what he was doing, etc., etc., and found it very difficult to cooperate with even the tiny suggestions they made about how he could continue his recovery. He then rang me to tell me that he'd just been rung by a senior consultant at Britain's leading hospital dealing with these matters, who had not just asked about his physical condition, etc., etc., but had asked how it was affecting his relationships, how it was affecting his sex life, how it was affecting his eating, how it was affecting his mood in general, etc., etc. Now, I just use that as a concrete example of two different ways in which clinicians engaged with him as a patient. I think they're concrete enough to give enough direction.
Yeah, I think that's good. Peter Lockman raises the question, why is it that we've lost kindness as part of what we do? Do you think medical students come with kindness and lose it in their training? Or
well, there's too much research to say that after 7 years training, trainees have got less compassion than when they started, for me not to quote that. Now, whether they really have, or whether they have had it boxed in and reduced in status alongside other issues is another question. I'm very suspicious of such studies, let's be quite clear, but I use them. The second issue is the way organizations have become industrialized, and where, you know, your metaphor of people being gears or cogs in wheels, etc., is very like the experience that I'm told by many, many senior clinicians, even ones who've reached very high heights in their organizations, and they don't feel able to contribute themselves as a person. They feel very limited in terms of what they're allowed to do, to say. And then finally, people frequently are not feeling safe in cultures that are bullying, over-expecting, demanding, neglecting of the cost to them of the work they're doing. And all that eats away at people's kinship. It eats away their own self-compassion, let alone their compassion for others. And it's dangerous. And I think the problem is the more we know of the hard science end of things, the more we're tempted to simply design the system and monitor it, rather than recognize that even using today's brilliant knowledge contains as much risk to you as a human being as you do it, has as much cost to you as you encounter the illness that you're trying to cure, and the risk that it won't work, and indeed managing the tensions with your colleagues. No matter how clever the intervention, those things remain.
Yeah. What strikes me, John, in the way that you were describing that, and in the way that I've tried to piece these things together, is the sort of the challenges that the members of the improvement community, the people that are working about improving the system, actually have adopted without sort of a deeper reflection, a product making logic. That is to say, we, the professionals, are responsible for making something, and you, the recipient, are responsible for buying it or using it appropriately. And so we've created this distortion in the fundamental truth of what you suggested with your friend and his experience, where the relational issues and the work together to try to make the service is actually the truth about service making, and it isn't a product to be made. And so the logic that improvement science has brought to bear on improving healthcare service has often sort of conveniently overlooked this point that I think we're discussing, and that I think has also contributed to this.
I think a lot's to do with what you look at, because many an improvement scientist I've worked with is very well aware of the problem you raised there, but it's also quite often the culture in which they work and we
Yeah.
work,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
where you have an intervention and you bring it in.
Yeah.
So if you ask the two teams why the service isn't working very well, they may well tell you, well, actually, the leader of the other team is depressed, drinking too much, and their marriage is breaking down, and they never listen to any of their colleagues, and they're never there when I ring them, rather than we should be redesigning the system together. I use a
Yeah.
deliberately melodramatic example there to
Yeah.
suggest that one of the key issues that underpins all the thinking of me and my colleagues is about asking people what they know and what they feel before you decide what the intervention is, whether you're an improvement scientist or a doctor or a manager.
Yeah. 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 So Madge has asked, can you talk about how-to strategies to create psychological safety in multi-tier teams?
I can, and I'm going to try and do it briefly. I'm going to design it, as it were. I'm going to say that unless leadership in an organization recognize the need for safety, kinship, and collaboration and its core effect on outcomes for everybody, you're going to struggle because you're going to be subversive. It's worth being subversive, but it would be great if the system is led by people who realize that their bread and butter and the well-being of them and everybody who works for them will thrive if they pay attention to it. Secondly, the recognition that their system is a potentially fragmented one, potentially competitive one, potentially ill-balanced in terms of where the resources are going one, and that opening up a dialogue between the leaders of all those pieces in various ways starts to allow reality to be what everybody's talking about rather than wish fulfillment. Then there's the issue at a team level, a subsystem level, a specialty level, or whichever way you want to put it, which is that if the person with the leadership responsibility is trained sufficiently to understand what happens in groups of human beings and how they can behave, and if they have a basic number of skills as to how to apply that knowledge as the leader of a system, then you've got the conditions within which honesty and openness, some of the things that were in your earlier slides, Paul, being open to the truth about what's happening, being able to reflect upon it, to be able to be honest about what you're bringing to it or what it's doing to you, and being able to collaborate with each other to get the best out of each other and to keep each other safe, then becomes possible. And then obviously at the individual level, this is one of the key issues that is in the whole picture. Quite often everything is individualized and you're told you're responsible for your own well-being. You should become mindful. You should do compassionate mind training. You should do reflective practice all on your own. You should go to Zumba classes in the lunch break, all that sort of stuff. However, unless the individual buys in, and unless training and development and education has taught them that how they are as a human being psychologically on their own and in relationship to others is key to the effectiveness of their practice. If their training and education has not built that into them, then they're quite likely to say, I'm not going to get into the navel gazing you're inviting me to get into. Mm-hmm. But unless I do gaze at my navel and note what's happening to me, note that I brought in a row with my wife this morning to work, note that I've just seen the 17th person die of COVID today, and that it's making me want to kill. Unless I realize that what's happening inside me as a human being and inside me as a practitioner, and what's happening in my relationships with my colleagues around me, if I value that as a perspective, I will then begin to reflect on them. And that will enable me to manage myself better in this kinship knife edge, as it were, on this kinship knife edge. And it will also lead me, perhaps, to be ready to notice those things in others rather than to expect machine behavior from them, or to simply write off the vulnerable as useless, which I'm sorry, I've been in teams where that has happened and where the vulnerable have actually been the most brilliant practitioners in the team when they were looked after.
Yeah. So my sense, Madge, is that it's a situation where the leader's courage and curiosity, as John was talking about, to share their own inquiry about what they're learning is the invitation for others to share their learning and to begin to create this safe space for the exploration and discovery that is actually required. My sense is that the challenge that John is calling out is this challenge of using this insight, but also being aware of the edges of this insight. And I think that that is part of what intelligent kindness is about. That's part of what the challenges that we face. It isn't that somehow we've discovered Ubuntu or that we've discovered some secret sauce. It's noticing in today's world the importance of what has been known in many ways for centuries, and in many indigenous cultures, and as well in philosophy. I mean, the Spanish philosopher Jose Ortega y Gasset said, "I am me and my circumstances." And what he was doing was to put in front of us all the importance of the culture and the context in which we try to live out and work and do a response as professionals to these challenges we face.
I think what I think that that's a really helpful thing to place it in a historical context, because I don't think that anything I'm saying is really very new. I think what I'm saying is something that actually needs assertion and understanding,
Yeah.
and not an easy sort of agreement that is nice to be nice. We've now got research in the present in social psychology and various other modes, in economics, in healthcare, that social capital, the quality of social capital, for which your Spanish philosopher might use the word circumstance in lots of ways,
Yes, yes.
is absolutely key to community well-being, to health, to alcohol taking, to crime, etc., etc. It's also very, very indicative of the individual's well-being as well. The better they are, their social capital, the healthier and more creative they're likely to be. And why should that be true when you're just looking at a town, and not true when you're looking at a hospital?
Yeah, yeah. So what I'm going to try to do is to share my screen, because John and I had a couple more slides that we were going to use. I was struck by, can you see my screen now? So last year was the year that Paul O'Neill died. Paul was such a deep thinker about the work of the leader in establishing a safe workplace, and a workplace that people felt like they could make their contribution. And he said once, an organization with the capacity for greatness is one where people have the capacity to say yes to these three simple propositions. I'm treated with dignity and respect every day. I'm permitted, trained, and encouraged to give my life meaning by making a contribution to the value creating work here. And I'm recognized for the contributions that I make. And I have often thought about these three very straightforward propositions as we face multiple question employee surveys. And I'm thinking, why is it that we can't sort of focus on something that seems to me to be such a plainly spoken invitation to take what John has been saying and his colleagues have been saying, and to really treat it with the respect that it deserves. So where will you start as you go forward, as you try to think about the what has been talked about here, and as you think your allies will line up, as you try to think about who they will be, and if you're really trying to take this and integrate it into how you do your work, and not sort of just think about it, who will you check in with in a week or so in your setting to sort of have a conversation about this and the way that you're doing on these themes? I'm mindful of the fact that this hour moves very quickly, and I want to honor. There's one more question that we got from Liam. A particular challenge for doctors in training who rotate through different clinical sites over many years is this feeling of disconnect from the organization they are temporarily working in. How can we develop kinship in these short-term kind of settings and contexts that is in the training, the rotational dynamics of a training program? And I think that John, you've probably addressed that situation elsewhere as well.
I just wanted to pick up, I was typing an answer to Liam as you spoke. If I've given the impression that it's all down to leadership, I apologize. What I've suggested is leadership has to approve, give permission for, and value the kinds of developments that might be needed at different levels. With trainees, it's a big question, clearly, but obviously build groups of them who can process and share their experience as they go through in their various links in different institutions, and that they have a home group that matters. I know this happens in lots of places. Ensure that there is real reflective supervision and mentoring, not just performance management, etc. But I also suspect there are some people listening and some people working here, given the time that we're working within, who have done a lot of work on how trainees can be supported into human systems and across those boundaries into alien environments and back, as it were. I know that colleagues down in London that I know of have done a lot of work on this, but there must be people in this network today who can share answers to that.
Yeah.
So I'm going to shut up now, Paul.
Yeah. So Lisa asked one final question. We are witnessing what John is speaking about in the semi-structured interviews that we're doing with patients and parents about co-production dashboards. We start by asking about their relationship with their child's clinician. And many speak about the trust or magic or caring or communication that exists in their relationship. I wonder how we can use John's model as a framework for analyzing our results. Do you have any comments about that, John?
I think that's a really flattering question, Lisa. I'd be very happy to work with others to co-produce an answer to it.
Yeah.
But very, very briefly, I know I'm very cautious about any of the models that I've shared turning into techniques, technologies. Yeah. I want them to provoke, but certainly I think one could unpick some of those case studies, those stories, to actually look very closely at what the issues that led to that trust were, what were the contributions by the clinician, etc., etc. But I think you're opening a big question. I'd like to see people being able to use, for example, the virtuous circle as a check-in for all sorts of ways of looking and analyzing behavior. So not just being videoed as I work with a patient in my trainee days, but actually having a model for how to look at that video. I know there's been work up in the University of York in Britain using attachment theory to look into such videos. There is a lot of room for applying our model and its very close cousins, because as I keep saying, there's nothing unique about what we're trying to say. It's just that it needs saying.
Yeah, I like that response because it's not like this is a magic powder that you just add water to, but it's more a matter of recognizing the truth that's here and exploring uh, with these patients. So, what has led to this magic in the semi-structured interview? You're talking about these caring. What did the person do that made you feel that way, or how? Unpack it yourself. Don't just assume that the words that there is something special or some special sauce exists and note it or put a tick box in a box about it, but push into it. Try to find out why it is that people come to that. Let me stop. I think we need to sort of be mindful that uh, our next time will be session number 6, and we'll be trying to bring together these various frames as we've been trying to explore and open this idea, not to close this idea, but to open these ideas. And my sense is that uh, we need to explore what they might require and how you might start and what might you need to measure and what some of their limits might be and how these sessions have helped. And if we were to ever think about doing something like this again, what would make them better or even more useful. I'd like to be sure that it's clear, John, that we have deeply appreciated your time with us today and what you have shared with us as you have so generously done. Our next session of this series will be in April, in mid-April, April 15th. But what we're trying to do here in these sessions is to open, not close, this idea of co-production. There's a whole lot more to this idea as we sort of bring it into daily life, as John suggested, as we sort of work at the how-to, not the about. So this is not so much about co-production as it is an invitation to think how to co-produce the healthcare service and what might be involved in that. And your presentation, John, was really helpful to us as we sort of bring this basic platform or frame into our vision so that we can then begin to use it and work from it. Thanks again.